Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you, as I am delighted also to be with our panelists today for answering the call, Iranian-Americans and the Climate Crisis. This program was conceived in part through a series of conversations I've had with friends and colleagues who feel like I do, that there is so much more we need to be doing to address the current crisis around our climate. And since we've all been cooped up at home, I think we've been sort of thinking about the pandemic and not about the bigger context in which the pandemic fits. So I was really delighted by the idea that the three people that are with us today, Atossa Soltani, Farhad Ebrahimi, and Mona Shamali, could be with us to talk a little bit about their work as climate activists and leaders, and also in the context of being Iranian Americans, some of the ways that their backgrounds and interests are touched by their own heritage as Iranians and Iranian Americans. I want to start today because it's National Poetry Month and I love poetry. I'm going to read a poem by William Stafford called "In Response to a Question, What Does the Earth Say?" The earth says, have a place, be that place, be what that place requires. Hear the sound the birds imply and see as deep as ridges go behind each other. Some people call their scenery flat, their only pictures framed by what they know. I think around them rise a riches and a loss too equal for their chart, but absolutely tall. The earth says every summer have a ranch that's minimum, one tree, one well, a landscape that proclaims a universe, sermon of the hills, hallelujah mountain, highway guided by the way the world is tilted, reduplication of mirage, flat evening, a kind of ritual for the wavering. The earth says, where you live, wear the kind of color that your life is, gray shirt for me, and by listening with the same bowed head that sings, draw all things into one song, join the sparrow on the lawn and row that easy way, the rage without met by the wings, within that guide you anywhere the wind blows. Listening, I think that's what the earth says. Today we are joined by three activists who've actually been involved with local and indigenous communities, so it's incumbent upon me to recognize that San Francisco State is located in the occupied territories of the Ohlone peoples and the coastal Miwok, and are organized as the Federated Indians of Grattan Rancheria. And I'm going to start by introducing Atossa Soltani, a dear friend and someone I deeply admire. She's been a global campaigner for tropical rainforests and indigenous rights for 3 decades. She's the founder and board president of Amazon Watch and served as the organization's first executive director for 18 years. Currently, Atossa is the director of global strategy for Amazon's Sacred Headwaters Initiative, working in alliance with 30 indigenous nations to protect 86 million acres in the most biologically diverse ecosystem on Earth. She is the Hillary Institute 2013 Global Laureate for Climate Leadership and is a producer of the film The Flow, a feature-length documentary currently in production about learning from nature's genius. Farhad Ebrahimi is a new friend. He's the founder and president of the Chorus Foundation, which works for a just transition to a regenerative economy in the United States. The Chorus Foundation supports communities on the front lines of the old extractive economy to build new bases of political, economic, and cultural power for systemic change. Farhad is also a musician, a lover of film and literature, and a lapsed bicycle snob. He graduated from MIT in 2002 with a bachelor's degree in mathematics and computer science. He currently lives in Brooklyn, but I hear he's heading west to California soon. Mona Shamali, who I've known for a long time, is currently the director of the New Leaders Initiative, a youth environmental leadership program based in Berkeley. She's been working at the intersection of environmental policy and social justice for over 20 years. She's taught international environmental policy and environmental justice courses at the New School, Pace University and New York University. She's also been a researcher for the Sarayaku versus Ecuador case in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, as a policy analyst for NGO that lobbied the United Nations on behalf of small island states, and an assistant researcher for the World Bank report on climate change and water distribution in Senegal. She's my dear friend, and she is also a visual artist. So without further ado, I asked each of them to talk a little bit about the work that they're doing, how they came to it, and some of the passions they have on this subject of climate change, climate justice, and regenerative economies. Atousa, take it away.
Thank you so much, Persis, and thank you to the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies. It's an honor to be with you all today here in the eve of Earth Day. And I'm, delighted to be speaking to this community. I'm basically a longtime forest activist, as you've mentioned in my bio, and I guess it all started for me in the very first week in college, where I, literally was, I think, walking around University of Akron. I moved here as a teenager during the revolution. And the very first week in college, I received a pamphlet about the Gaia Hypothesis. Now, of course, people who were in the 70s in the US know there was a lot of hostility towards Iranians during the hostage crisis. It wasn't really an identity that was very popular to be out there. And I don't know what I would say, but I would say that the Gaia Hypothesis spoke to this deeper part in me that was looking to belong. Now that I'd been living in Akron, Ohio, removed from my homeland, to a place that was that felt home. And it was this really search for the Gaia Hypothesis. For those who may not have heard of it, is James Lovelock, and he came out with this hypothesis in the late 70s, early 80s that said literally the Earth is not just this floating rock in space. It's actually a living, interactive, intelligent, self-regulating, self-evolving organ. It's more like an organism than a planet, that the Earth is alive virtually, and basically that there are conditions that are conducive to life that are maintained, and by the Earth maintaining these conditions conducive to life, the exact right balance of oxygen, CO2, nitrogen, all of the chemicals that are in the atmosphere in order to sustain life, and that it had done that for billions of years within this really narrow margin, and that it really was alive. And so that understanding that the Earth was a living system, and that we were part of this organism, we were these cells in the body of a living organism, was really an awakening moment for me. And it's exactly what I needed to belong to something greater, belong to the planet beyond any national borders or political boundaries, or the racism that we face, etc. And so that started a path. And then I also, on my very first week in college, met my best friend at the time, who was a biologist, conservation biologist, and she had spent a lot of time in the Peruvian Amazon, and she started telling me about the Amazon rainforest, as if those things really lit up a passion in me that I've been at for many years. So my work has taken me to work with indigenous peoples in all over South America, all over the Amazon basin, also with around the world too. I've had a pleasure of working in a number of other landscapes with indigenous peoples who are working to protect their territories, which happen to be, as a context to say that indigenous peoples' territories have 80% of all plant and animal species that remain on planet Earth today in 2021 are on indigenous lands. And that we, working with indigenous peoples, have learned a great deal of practical knowledge about the ecosystems that we inhabit, but also philosophy and wisdom to how we live in harmony with nature. And so anyway, so that's my path has taken me to the Amazon. I work with the Rainforest Action Network, and we then went on to found Amazon Watch, and I directed Amazon Watch for almost 18 years. And then I've since transitioned as a board president, and I'm working on the ground in the forest, building a movement, building a coalition, working with 30 indigenous nations in this area of the Amazon that's critical for the headwaters of the Amazon. It's critical for the protection of the Amazon, but it's also important for climate. This idea that the climate and the rainforests are part of the system of a living earth is something that I've, really have my entire career has been sort of following that. And just to give you a sense, the Amazon rainforest generates, the amount, generates flying rivers, atmospheric rivers that bring rain to South America, but also drive rainfall into North America, to California, to the Sierra Nevada, to the entire planet. It's like the Amazon works like almost a heart of the planet. Not only is it the largest rainforest, but it's the largest mobilizer of water and vapor, and it generates rainfall, and it's literally the rain machine of the planet. It's also been called the lungs of the earth, as in the way that the trees absorb CO2 and they breathe out oxygen. And that whole system of, basically circulating oxygen, carbon, but also water, it makes the Amazon as a vital organ of that living earth. So why is it important to the climate? I think that every tree is half carbon. So if we lost the Amazon, we will have detonated the largest carbon bomb on the planet. And so it's really important to recognize that the Amazon also absorbs about 25% of all man-made emissions every year. So it's literally absorbing carbon, pumping water, generating, being a vital organ for Gaia, for the planet. And that's the kind of work we've been trying to do, is put that message, say that the Amazon, protecting the Amazon is central to addressing climate. And protecting the Amazon, who better protects the Amazon than the indigenous and local communities? So it's not separate to fight for the rainforest and fight for human rights or indigenous rights. They're actually one and the same. They come together in this part of the world, and that's been my honor and joy to be part of that movement.
Thank you, Atusa. That was a wonderful introduction. Farhad, I'm happy to have you go next. Talk a little bit about your work.
Sure thing, thanks. So I'm going to talk about the Chorus Foundation, which is an organization that I started around 15 years ago, and it's been my full-time job for a little over a decade. But I wanted to start by acknowledging that there are a lot of critiques of the philanthropic sector, and I'm not talking about the George Soros conspiracy theories, which are straight up anti-Semitic, but you all may have heard phrases like nonprofit industrial complex, revolution will not be funded, or the idea that the Gates Foundation isn't purely a force for good, or just the general idea that donors and foundations play a very large and very problematic role in determining which solutions are developed for which problems. And so as somebody who's been in the sector for over 15 years, I can report that yes, it's that bad. It might even be worse than you think. And that there are folks trying to approach things differently from within the philanthropic sector and ultimately challenge it from within. And that's going to be part of what I talk about. But you might be wondering how I ended up in philanthropy. That story starts with a successful tech entrepreneur. That tech entrepreneur was not me. It was my dad, who struck gold in the desktop publishing industry back in the mid 80s. And so my introduction to philanthropy was as a member of a wealthy family. Now, it's worth noting that I'm the radical lefty straight out of central casting in my family, but I'm also very much of my family. And I think my parents' dual refugee experiences, my father's Iranian, my mother was born in Cuba, was, I think, seminal in sort of giving me a perspective on the world. My parents would talk politics with us all the time when I was growing up. They would even yell at the TV sometimes when we were watching the news. And I think at the end of the day, a lot of those conversations were really about community self-determination, the idea that the folks who live in a place should be able to decide what happens in that place. And those conversations really shaped both my political and my personal perspectives on a lot of things. At the same time, there was this question of the family money. And my response to that was essentially to try to give away all the wealth that was put under my direct control. Long story short, I never felt like it was mine. And I'd come to question the circumstances that allowed my family to accumulate it in the first place. So, blah, 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 lefty straight out of central casting. But bottom line, I promised myself that I'd create some sort of wealth redistribution project by the time I turned 30. And so 15 years ago, the foundation began, I think, somewhat conventionally. I was a living donor, and I was taking some of the advice that living donors are given. You pick an issue, you pick a measurable outcome, and you go for it. And my issue was climate change. And so I set out to learn what other climate funders were supporting, Let's just say the results were mixed, and that's being extremely generous in some cases. I'd also be lying if I claimed that we didn't make some mistakes of our own in the early days of the foundation. And so reflecting on those mistakes, we chose a different path. We saw that the fundamental challenge of the climate crisis wasn't in identifying the best policy or the most promising technology or the scariest science, that it was and still is in generating the power and the political will to enact those policies, to adopt those technologies, to heed that science. And so this realization led us to take a closer look at the landscape of power, the lack of organized political power on the part of the US climate movement, the entrenched economic power of the fossil fuel industry, and the deep cultural power of doing business as usual in the places where that business has historically been done. So like the huge cultural footprint of coal and the coal industry in places like Central Appalachia. And so we shifted away from a issue focus on climate and more framework around building and shifting power. So for a lot of climate folks that I spend time with, I'm like the power building or community organizing person. And then for a lot of community organizing folks who I spend time with, I'm the climate person, which is actually, I really enjoy being in that position. And I think bridge building comes naturally to somebody raised in a multiracial household. So what the foundation funds with this lens around power is multi-issue organizations and efforts building and shifting power in communities that have historically had power wielded against them. Black folks, indigenous peoples, immigrants and refugees of color, and working class folks more broadly. And it's really about building and shifting political, economic, and cultural power for transformative system change. So it's not about any one issue, but what are the systemic root causes that can address multiple issues. I should be clear that this is about supporting grassroots organizations to do what they believe is the most strategic, not funding a diverse group of people to do what we want them to do, because we believe that those closest to the problem know the most about what the solutions need to look like. And our grantees don't just talk about climate solutions or even climate justice. They talk more about the concept of just transition, which is really a concept that has roots in the labor movement and now has a long history in other aligned social movements as well. And it's really an approach to systemic change that centers questions of equity and power and justice. The idea that systems change all the time, that transition is inevitable, but justice is not. That clearly applies to questions of energy transition around climate, but it also applies to transitions around policing and mass incarceration, or housing, or immigration, or any number of other things. And the way that I tend to think about it myself is if you're getting thrown under the bus, you don't really care if it's solar powered or not. But it's not just about what we fund, it's about how we fund. And this is where we're trying to approach philanthropy differently. I think funders clearly have a tremendous amount of power. We generally don't wear it particularly well. And philanthropy itself can often be one of the biggest obstacles to transformative work. It's possible to fund the right things in the wrong way. And so for us, applying that lens of power and thinking about not just holding power accountably, but sharing power and ultimately handing over power entirely. So in terms of holding power accountably, we make long-term unrestricted grants to organizations. We try to build open and honest, trusting and vulnerable relationships with our grantees and community members. We're really building trust toward that idea of sharing power equitably, co-designing tactics and strategies and processes with grantees and community members, building processes and structures for democratized decision-making within the foundation. So like I and foundation staff and foundation board, we really don't make decisions about where resources go. It's community members and community organizations to get to do that now. But really all of this is about exercising our collective muscles for handing power over entirely. We're spending down our entire endowment. That's going to happen in just a couple years in 2023. We're open to making what they call equity grants, essentially supporting our grantees to do things like buy land or seed loan funds, leaving them not just with a grant they use, but something productive. And ultimately supporting the creation of alternative institutions that live beyond the life of the foundation itself. And so I'll just land on the idea that ultimately we see ourselves as a transitional form, that we're not one of those foundations. I'm not one of those funders who believes that this is the way things should be in perpetuity, but we see ourselves as playing a constructive interventionist role to demonstrate how philanthropy could behave differently and ultimately how we could put ourselves out of business. That's how we think about spending down. And so I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Farhad. Mona, can you talk a little bit about your work with young people and leadership initiatives.
Of course. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us, Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies. So my path has been very much zigzagging in that I got a degree in environmental studies and I started to do policy work. And then I got a degree in international relations and continued to do policy work. And then I taught a course, an international environmental policy course at the New School. And I was deeply entrenched in UN agreements and, oil conflicts and international disputes about, organic foods, the biosafety protocol, you name it, everything international. And what I found was that I started to care less about the substantive course material, and I cared more about the students and their process. I taught a study abroad program in Guyana, a human rights program, and I became so interested in the students and what they were going through and how I could build their capacity that I thought to myself, hold on a second, I think I may want to pivot to working with youth as the primary focus of my career and not just the vehicle of teaching international environmental policy. So fast forward, I'm now the director of the New Leaders Initiative at Earth Island Institute. And we run a youth leadership program where we take cohorts of youth environmental leaders who are already prolific in their issue area, and we support them. And what I mean by support is we run workshops for them, everything from fundraising to social media to capacity building to anti-oppression training. Let's see if I'm forgetting any. Speech coaching, leadership skills clinic. We do visioning. So we really arm these young people who, first of all, I just want to plug for a second young people. Young people are really not jaded. They are idealistic. They are not practical and rigid yet. They are just full of ideas and life. And as we get older, we become more practical and we say things like, oh, that won't work, or this won't work, or let me be more realistic. But young people aren't in that space. They're not worried about being realistic, which is when all their ideas bubble to the top, and they're futuristic and they see things that aren't possible yet. So in my role, I see myself as, let me put it this way, a young activist is like a person sitting in a boat. They have a vision. They want to get to the other side of the river. So they're sitting in the boat, but perhaps the water's choppy, they're moving in the boat, but what we are able to give them in our program is a paddle or an oar so that they can push that water and get to the other side of the river, get to where they want to go. So that paddle or that oar is the toolbox or the chest of skills that we give them or we arm them with to support their own already nascent ideas and goals and visions. So for example, when we do a visioning workshop with them, we chart out what their vision is, and then we talk about the steps that we take to get to that vision. And one of our activities, for example, is imagining an object across the room as the vision. And then we walk with our leader, we walk towards the object slowly, one foot in front of the other, and we discuss what we're going through as we get to the vision. So in my role, I've been supporting young people who have, some of their campaigns have been divestment from fossil fuel campaigns at universities. We've supported organizers for the US Youth Climate Strike, Sustain Us, Youth versus Apocalypse. We've supported young people who have passed local legislation, climate change legislation, signed bills. We've supported young people who have fought refineries in low-income communities, indigenous youth that are fighting pipelines. So when they come to us, they are already full-fledged environmental activists. our program is just as the name, New Leaders Initiative. We just train them in how to take their leadership to the next level. So I love my work because now I am in a position where I work with young people full time. And I really see that as my skill set, which is supporting and building capacity for young people, specifically 16 to 21. So that is my favorite age. And so I'm working with that age, and it's really great.
Thank you, Mona. So I'm struck by the kind of synergy between the three of you, because in some ways there's like this idea of big picture, the lungs of the Amazon and indigenous communities, like someplace else, but someplace that touches us. And then Farhad, the idea of empowering communities. And then Mona's kind of empowering youth. And I just wonder if you have any comments or questions for each other, because in some ways you're all working towards similar kinds of goals, but coming at it from a slightly different perspective. And obviously the big picture is our planet and ways of bringing dignity to people as well.
I'll just jump in and say, yeah, everything that Mona and Farhad say resonate strongly with me in my own work over the last 3 decades. I think a lot of the issues we're facing are systemic in nature. You know, we are suffering from both a crisis of perception of the way we see the earth and see each other, as well as a systemic, a system that is basically an economic system that's life blind, that devours nature and devours people. That a capitalist, system that's bent on growth in money system, a financial system that's based on growth, infinite growth, that doesn't distinguish between, flourishing of human and societal flourishing, which is like a qualitative growth of how we become more educated, more healthier, better, more peaceful, support arts and well-being and happier, versus a system, a financial system that's kind of programmed at its core level to grow and be more like a infinite growth at all cost, indifferentiated between flourishing and devouring the thing that's life, that's the basis of life that sustains us. So we need deep change, systemic change, far-reaching change. The people in the Amazon that I work with, they're fighting, they're putting their bodies in the line, they're dying for their activism to stop, for example, illegal gold mining or even industrial gold mining from coming to become jewelry in that jewelry that we buy in the United States. Or 1 in 6 tanks of gas we might pump in California comes from oil from the Amazon rainforest. And so we are connected. We're in this global economic system. We are in this global, sphere of influence where large corporations and pools of money like BlackRock, which are these huge financial institutions, control and drive decisions that go beyond democracy and beyond politics. And so we have these systemic changes that we need. Also, I think a lot of the work we're doing is about empowering the people who are the stewards of the rainforest. And they're also, they've actually have demonstrated that they have a philosophy that works, this collective philosophy that we're about being good ancestors to future generation. If we are able to uphold and support Indigenous peoples in defending their territories, we actually will benefit, just not only because of protecting the forest, but we might learn something about how to live in harmony with nature. So I was struck by the work to do, and a lot of the Sacred Headwaters work. What we've been doing is we've been listening for the last 4 years to 30 Indigenous communities about solutions that they see as the solutions to their crisis. And one of those solutions has been about, we've been fighting we tend to, even in the climate movement, to fight in silos, to pick the 3 things we need to do to change things. What are the 3 most important things, or what are the 1 thing that we got to do? And this siloed approach has really created competition and division. Whereas what we need to do is be mycelial, be interconnected and interwoven, and build movements, movements that are calling for coherence to life-centric well-being centric economic system and political system and governance system and value system and societal shifts. And so I find that those conversations are happening at 4 a.m. in the jungle with drinking, this tea called Wayusa with communities like the one, Mona, you helped, Sarayaku and others. They're having this conversation in the forest about who we are as humanity, our identity, and our strive for unity. And at the same time, we're having those conversations in political conversations around, basically our movements here in North America, our movements around the world for climate justice, for climate action. And, we do need to see these interwoven, interconnected movements and build those movements, because we do have this basically precipice. We're reaching a tipping point on multiple levels. There's a tipping point, and this is why we need the Fridays for the Future and the youth, because they're actually are the only thing that's driving change right now is the youth movement that's really speaking loud and clear. People that have been, getting the attention of Fridays for the Future, the weekly protests that people are part of. I think that is ultimately the young people are the hope. The indigenous peoples are the beacons guiding kind of where we need to go. Unity is a key theme in terms of looking at not just like, I love your, Farhad, I loved your analogy. Like if you're getting thrown on the bus, it doesn't matter if it's a solar bus, same thing, it's like we have to look at systemic solutions. The whole idea of systems thinking is a new discipline in education. I hope the audience is looking into studying more systems approach, and the idea that every part of the system has to be in coherence. You can't have basically injustice in any part of the system if you want to have coherence. So injustice, and dealing with issues of wealth and power become paramount in that system. So where you have to say, we are designing a new system that works for everyone, that works for 100% of humanity. And through that, we will find coherence. It's a monumental task. We have to do it. It's urgent that we do it, but we can do it. Nature does it every day. If we look at the way nature distributes water and resources and, creates symbiotic relationships of where trees communicate with each other, share nutrients, help each other grow, where, there's all this symbiosis between species of plants and animals, that really we can mimic nature's genius and find a way through the quagmire that we're in now.
Farhad or Mona, do you want to respond to anything you heard from each other?
I mean, I'll just say really quick that everything that Atossa just said really resonates with me. I mean, if we're interested in systems change, it takes a system to change a system. And as a funder, contrary to some of my peers in philanthropy, like our job is not to say which parts of the ecosystem are legitimate or dictate what the ecosystem should do. It's to make sure the system is resourced equitably and sustainably, and to support the building of relationships across the ecosystem. Because an ecosystem is not a list of things, right? It's a web of relationships. And so everything you just said really resonates. And then just something else that I hear as a theme across all three of us is just the importance of relationship building and leadership development in this work, that and actually wanted to complicate the frame of empowering, because rather than empowering, I think of the work we do as supporting folks to recognize and unlock their own latent power. The power is already there. We're not giving anybody anything, but we're supporting them to build the power and organize the power that they already had.
Yeah, I would add to that, we're building capacity too. I think that Farhad, right on what you just said, and Atossa, right on. And I just to respond to both of you, I am struck by how we're all doing international environmental work. And Farhad, you come from an international family. I mean, we all do. We're Iranian-Americans. But whether it's indigenous people or whether it's being from a Cuban Iranian household, I can't help but notice that, that we're not doing just domestic California work. We are doing international environmental work. And so that to me speaks volumes. And I think it comes from the fact that we are a part of the diaspora. So when you come from the diaspora, it's easier to think of international work because you already know what it's like to live 1 foot in and 1 foot out of a culture. So it's easier to move cultures and move in between spaces. So I was just struck by that link that we all have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I wonder if, one of the things that I love everything that I'm hearing from all of you, but both the urgency, the idea that we're near a tipping point, and then the kind of systemic thinking that we have to sort of transform, right? From this idea of that there's only one way to do things. Do you see, can you give examples? You gave a good example, Atosa, from the idea of listening to people. I wonder, Farhad, if you could talk a little bit about some of the success is probably the wrong word, but some of the ways in which you see the work that your foundation has supported actually doing some of that transformative thinking work that we need, because it's a philosophical change, not just a concrete policy.
Yeah, for me, that's a big part of when we talk about power. We're so focused foundation, but we try to have a more expansive definition of what we mean by power. So not just political power, which can be electoral or otherwise, the ability to influence or control collective decision making, and not just economic power, but cultural power. Our culture defines our sense of what books or economics even are. And for us, some of the places where we've seen really tangible shifts in the work that's happening at the community level has been in that cultural space. And so I'll give an example. We've been supporting work in Eastern Kentucky for well over a decade now. And the seed of that work around climate was around coal extraction and mountaintop removal. And the idea that we can't have climate solutions in this country that are going to leave communities like Eastern Kentucky behind and just say like, oh, well, they missed the boat. Their economy's built on coal. I guess there's nothing we can do for them. But to really think about what it looks like to build alternatives and local living economies in those places. But I was, a few years ago, I was in Kentucky with a number of other funders from around the country who were there for their first time. And we were in Hazard, Kentucky, which is a town right in the coal fields, deep history with the coal industry. And some of my fellow funders, we're walking around downtown talking about economic development and post-coal economies. And some of my fellow funders were coming up to me and being like, yeah, you've talked about this stuff so much. And I don't know, I thought it was going to be edgier. This seems good. They're doing some economic development stuff. And I paused for a moment, like, why isn't this connecting with them the way that they expected it was? And then I realized like, oh, yeah, when I first started coming here, they never would have brought me here. They never would have brought a bunch of us into this town center to talk about post-coal economies, because we would have been targeted and intimidated, and our tires would have been slashed, and we would have been run out of town by the established power structure that was invested in the established economy. But there had not only been a political shift, right, where there was a new mayor and a new city council and all those kinds of things, and not just an economic shift where they were talking about alternative economics, alternative to coal economies, economic development. There was a cultural shift where it was no longer a taboo to talk about energy coming from anything but coal, right? It was no longer a taboo to talk about a bright future that was not about, more coal jobs, bringing back the coal jobs. It was actually about acknowledging that coal's never going to be the employer it once was, nor should it be. And that was a cultural shift. And our grantees have always been really clear with us that this is not the kind of stuff they can say they're going to do in a year or 3 years, that this is the kind of stuff they can do over, the better part of a decade if they're given the space and the breathing room by their funders to actually do it. Because it involves a lot of pivoting, a lot of navigating, a lot of unexpected twists and turns that like a 1 year or 3 year grant proposal is just not going to be able to anticipate. So when we think about what looks successful to us, it's not they did everything they said they would do in their grant proposal. It's we trusted them. We got off their case, stopped breathing down their necks, and they were able to do some interesting things and shift things in unexpected ways over a longer time frame, and without the restrictions on how they use the money.
Mona, could you talk a little bit about some of the ways you see the work you're doing with young people contributing to this bigger kind of transformation and transformative moment around how they're becoming the future leaders?
Yeah, I'll use both. I'm going to try to use Farhad and Atosa's work in how I answer this. So I taught a course at NYU called Resource Conflicts in the Developing World. And that course was 3 case studies of where oil exploitation has created human rights struggles. So one case was Ecuador, the Sarayaku versus the state of Ecuador. Another one was Iran, Mossadegh's over the fact that he was overthrown, in the Hague case that I'm sure Iranians are all familiar with, 1953. And then the third one was Nigeria, the oil conflicts that have happened in the Ogoni Delta. So when I was working in as a adjunct faculty with students, what I noticed is that they very quickly absorb this information and they begin to reorganize their worldview. So I think I'm going to really plug for education, because I really think that, you know, and we are in a talk right now that's put on by an educational body. But I think that when you arm young people with information, especially the earlier that you arm them with information, it reorganizes their minds and it reorganizes their worldview. And then whoever they go on to be, whether they become a banker, they become a doctor, they become, you know, an architect, they are armed with these case studies and with this knowledge that affects what type of architect they're going to be, what type of doctor they're going to be. And so I think it's really important that we emphasize education and the role that that plays in arming young people as decision makers in their respective careers. Because I had a lot of students who weren't going to, you know, end up at the UN or weren't going to end up at environmental organizations. But if they went on to be, for example, an architect, then maybe they will design buildings for refugees, temporary housing for refugees. So I think, to answer your question, Persis, I think the sooner you can get knowledge into young people's heads that is curated for curiosity and not just as dumping information, like Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the more that you ask questions and the more that you get into conversation with young people, I think it really creates a tidal wave of change for any movement, and in this case, the environmental movement.
Great, thank you. There was a question, and it's kind of a question that I thought of too. And all of you are working in organizations or building networks and relationships. But for Iranian-Americans, this isn't at the top of their agenda. Let's just say that. They've been preoccupied with other things. But somebody had a question about how to collectively approach this, for example, in the Iranian-American community. And I wonder if you have any suggestions either about building those kinds of networks and relationships or strategies for getting this into places that maybe it hasn't been part of the conversation in our specific community.
I'm interested in the question of how we can really take ownership over our individual and collective stories, and the fact that Iran as a country has been deeply shaped by natural resource extraction. And rather than seeing that as like a mark against our credibility in environmental issues, actually see that as a wealth of context and stories and grounding, both individual and familial, as well as collective. I mean, I think it was only somewhere in the middle of my work around climate and environmental justice that it occurred to me to even tell anybody, like, oh yeah, my dad worked at an oil refinery when he was younger. That's kind of relevant, right? Like growing up the son of somebody who had worked at an oil refinery, that shapes the way I think of these things in ways that, like, if I don't say it out loud, I'm sort of doing a disservice to myself and my family and to others. And then the other thing I'll say is just that, I mean, maybe this is like everywhere, but I'm sure folks have been tracking how climate impacts have been hitting in Iran and the record heats and things like that. I mean, I just think there's a lot to ground our community in thinking about climate and thinking about, like extractive industry, but also thinking about how extractive industry complicates national history and complicates economic development and complicates foreign policy, because if anything, that would put us in a better position than perhaps some other folks to be drawing connections between climate and other issues.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Atosa, do you want to add something?
I would just add, I was thinking about the same thing. I spent 3 years of my childhood in Khorramshahr and Avaz in the oil belt. My dad worked for the Iranian insurance company, and we were by the tankers and oil tankers, and that was what we used to go for weekends to see the flames of Avaz. Those 300-foot flames. That was like we did some pastime. So I was around the oil industry as well, and I feel like it's part of my karma to be working on the front lines of a campaign that's currently gaining momentum, which we launched 6 years ago. It's finally gaining momentum to leave fossil fuels on the ground. We need a global treaty for leaving fossil fuels on the ground. We need countries to adopt it. We need cities to adopt it and states to adopt it. Today, Los Angeles became one of the first cities in the US, and Vancouver, another city in Canada, that have committed to the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. The idea that we commit over within a reasonable period of time, within the next 5 to 10 years, to ramp down and actually not issue any more new permits for expanding the oil fields, expanding production, building new pipelines, getting kind of the leading edge of that industry to stop growing, and then start to bring it back and pull it for work on a thoughtful planned transition that involves the people who are also in the oil industry. But that is finally happening. I think how people who live in, over 1 million Iranians live in Southern California. I think about how, the consumption, the majority of oil from the Amazon comes to the LA harbor, that it's consumed in our cars. So connecting the dots on how we're basically connected to this global economic system that needs to shift, and how we, rethink our identity. We're individuals, but we're also members of communities. Those are the Iranian-American community. That's also our local community. And we're also part of natural communities. We're part of watersheds. Where is our watershed? What is the source of our water wherever we live? I talk a lot with Indigenous people. It's like, how do we get people to be more like Indigenous people and care about their earth? And they say they need to belong to their watershed, belong to the place that supplies you with your water, and care for that place, be stewards to that place, wherever it is. But we can also say, be mindful consumers, be, really thoughtful about your banking and investments, be thoughtful about your, how you make a living. This whole idea of we make a living is truly needs to become about the future, what's on the horizon, which is restoration economies, transition economies that bring good paying jobs, to change the energy grid, to restore watersheds, to restore habitat, to create healthier air, healthier technologies for manufacturing things that we, basically need to live, but also really pull back on consumption, really talk about consumption. As a community, we defined our culture in opulent ways, the jewelry, the cars, the houses. We've defined wealth. We are, Iranian community has been very much always in a fashion conscious and conscious about a lot of things that were status symbols of status. I think we need to question that and say, what are the true things we want to leave our children? How about happiness and mental health and well-being and healthy communities are peaceful communities, and really be mindful about transforming. I'm supporting community support. Like, you can live in LA and support a community agriculture farm, a CSA that brings you fresh fruits and vegetables every week. You can be funding just with your monthly budget on groceries, funding a local farm. So there's a whole lot we can do, but I think it almost comes back to rethinking our identity. I'm a cell in a body of a host. My host is the earth. I live in this body and I serve the host. And as serving the host, I'm to be a good host. Iranians are great at being good hosts. To be a good host to life. What do I need to do with my money, with my consumption, with my life, work, and my purpose on this planet, and how I walk and what I do. And so it's a continuum, I think.
I loved what you talked about with respect to water, because it's something I'm exceedingly mindful of in California, that we have ongoing and prolonged droughts. And this year, unfortunately, is one of those years. And when I was recently in Central California, driving through the farm belt of California, I saw all these signs about how we need to build dams. It's big industrial farming, and they're pissed off at water control in California. But I read a headline somewhat recently about that 60%, let's see if I can find it, I wrote it down, that in between 2012 and 2016, parts of the Central Valley of California sunk as much as 60 centimeters per year. And it's basically from water extraction. And there was a quote by a geological survey worker who said, it's not an earthquake. It doesn't happen suddenly, but it's a slow motion disaster, the result of the region's insatiable thirst for groundwater. And similarly, in Iran, there's a statistic that by 2030, between 2030 and 2040, 70% of Iranian people will be without drinking water, and that could be a climate refugee crisis in the making. So it's a very interesting thing to think about, who is going to be a refugee and where, and how water, for example, is central to this question about climate, both in terms of that it's an absolutely necessary resource, but I think it's one of the ones that we sort of defer. And I wonder if in any of the work that you're doing, how the question about water and water resources, because we also know that water has been profitized, right? I think just this year, it's being sold on the stock market, right? Farhad, maybe you could say more about that. But that to me is concerning, because it exactly goes to that question about who gets the resources and how to distribute it, and also what the kind of urgency of water is in this whole question.
I mean, I'll just say that water privatization is terrifying. Like that. And that's an example of what the folks that we work with refer to as a false solution, right? That there's ways of talking about the climate crisis. There's ways of talking about policing and mass incarceration. There's ways of talking about housing, where the usual suspects, right, and essentially the kinds of organizations and kinds of individuals who have benefited by getting us into this mess, get to propose their idea of a way out, which, first of all, I don't think are credible solutions. But even if they are solutions, at what cost in terms of the continued extraction and consolidation of power from folks? Like, I mean, a just transition is not replacing fossil fuels with Wall Street renewables that are top down, that help the rich get richer and help the big banks get bigger. That should not be an acceptable solution to climate. And so all the dangers of water privatization and what that means for water access and how that will impact people who are already marginalized and oppressed and already have trouble getting water for their basic needs, for their agriculture, everything. It's downright dystopian in my perspective, but it's also like there, you can go to, I'm sure when the summit that good old Governor Brown and Mayor Bloomberg, who are held by some folks to be climate heroes, that summit that they had in San Francisco a number of years ago, some of the solutions that were proposed on that stage were very dangerous. And I think that one of the things that I've certainly learned is that when you hear somebody like Bloomberg or Jeff Bezos or whoever say that they're going to give all this money to climate, we need to ask questions about where that money's actually going and how it's actually moving. Because I think as the climate crisis becomes more and more visible to folks, you will see more and more individual donors, large foundations, well-resourced corporations, et cetera, feel like even if it's just for a PR move, they need to say they're doing something. And I think we need to be very clear-eyed, very critical, and prepared to challenge and push back when what they say they're doing is actually not a solution or is a middling solution at the cost of making other issues we care about a lot worse.
Yeah, exactly. I want to just jump in and say, I totally agree. I mean, we're in the mindset of, the primacy of the money system and markets. There's a great book by David Korten. It says, "Change the story, change the future." He really eloquently puts this whole concept that our entire culture and economic system and political system is geared around this money and market system. So every time solutions come up, there's always a tendency to be pushing for market-based solutions. Whereas in fact, what we need to do is be pushing for the commoning of solutions, that ultimately the commons, the water is the commons, forests are the commons, watersheds are the commons, the oceans are the commons. These are commons that have allowed humanity to flourish, and that ultimately we want to, basically learn better tools of commoning or commonification, as some people call it. And that idea that, water is life is as old as, human existence. In fact, there's a great video right now about the water paradigm. I can look for it while we're talking. The idea that, we want to nurture and harvest water. We want to cultivate water, and that ultimately wealth is the flowing of water, is wealth. Currency, for example, the word currency comes from water. And the more that we can, in order to deal with, there's a finite amount of vapor in the atmosphere, right? Water vapor. And we need to educate ourselves about the water cycle. That's a lot of what I did when I worked for the city of Santa Monica as a water conservation coordinator. I was like educating kids about the water cycle. We need to learn how the water is generated. Forests, plants, and, basically plants and forests draw in water, store water, capture water. That's why it's called watersheds. They're usually forests that are watersheds. So planting trees, planting gardens, planting forests are what's going to bring in water. In the Amazon, an average tree evapotranspires or sweats out 1,000 liters of water a day into the air. You have 400 billion trees in the Amazon. So you have these trees, each one 1,000 liters of water a day is sweated out. And all together, that's why you have these flying rivers that drive rainfall all the way. In fact, rainfall in the Amazon determines the moisture content over Sierra Nevada. So tomorrow's, this big summit that is happening, the Biden summit on the climate, my wish would be that the nature's, the living tissues and organs and blood flow of the earth itself was what we focused on as our economic livelihood. That we focused on nurturing that and cultivating it the way, farmers might cultivate apple orchards or permaculture farms. So I see that as a big issue, water. And and looking back at the Iranian history, remember Iran was one time covered in forests. there's poetry and historic references of, and when forests went, then deserts became, and the deserts became, there were wars over water, and wars over water led to long-term historic conflict. And you can look at many historical conflicts and wars around the world, and they go back to, water.
So I want to, can I add something to Atosa? Because I feel like what she said really resonated with me. People go to war for water. And one of the most famous water wars is the Cochabamba water war in Bolivia, where the government of Bolivia decided to privatize the water, and companies like Bechtel funded the privatization of the water. So people in Bolivia, indigenous people, formed local water organizing groups to fight the privatization. And they were so successful, they managed to strike and not pay their water bills. And they were so successful that some of the indigenous people traveled to the World Bank headquarters, because the World Bank was also a funder of the privatization project, and was able to make the case for why water should not be privatized and paid for in Bolivia. So in that case, indigenous people won a water war. So I feel like, yes, people go to war for water, and we're going to see that a lot more. There's water agreements signed between Lebanon and Israel. There's all of these international water agreements, and we're just going to see more and more of those as water becomes a scarcity, as it is every day, more and more.
On that note of conflict, there's a question from an attendee who says, would any of you be able to elaborate on how to approach the climate refugee crisis? In what ways are we ready or not ready to support climate-driven mass migration? Thinking about the ways the Iranian diaspora community has been uniquely affected by geopolitical borders, and if that offers us anything unique to bring to the climate refugee issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, climate refugees are, that's basically what's happening already. The island of Kiribati, for example, in Melanesia, has been sinking, and the president of Kiribati is looking for a new island to move 100,000 people that live on this island. So that's same thing in Alaska, same thing. And in places that desertification is happening in Africa, where water is drying up, that is causing, so how it manifests is through the loss of water, or it's an imbalance of water, either too much, like the rising of sea levels, or the complete desertification of the area. So we need to address that. We need to basically make that at the core of our climate adaptation mitigation. And what else I will say is, as I put in the video on water paradigm, you can watch it, but some of the science I'm seeing on modeling around how we can restore watersheds, and the beauty about restoring watersheds is it has to be local, many local watershed restoration, thousands of little neighborhood watershed restorations across the planet. Was that if we were to mobilize a global watershed restoration effort, reforestation and watershed restoration, we could reverse climate chaos within decades, not centuries. And that's, kind of new science. It's kind of like waking up and saying, wow, there is some truth as water is life, and we have just got to get the balance right. We got to get the, and same thing with, in terms of human migration, to be able to design, as humans are migrating, we having to support migration, because that's a human right, basic right to life. We have international treaties that protect the right to life, and migration and protecting refugees, climate refugees, is basically an obligation of states, obligation of the entire world, to design communities that are basically ecologically sound and net positive. I mean, the idea of the ecologically sound and ecologically beneficial is something we haven't even wrapped our head around. It's a design challenge. It's a design challenge that mixes ancient knowledge, the way Iranians designed water, or, coolers. We had freezers in the desert, right? We had wind catchers that cooled our houses. We had air conditionings in the desert. We designed with nature the same nation, mixing the ancient and what we know of how science is now able to see how nature's self-organizing and principles of natural systems, and then technology, what technology can do, combining the ancient and the modern, we could create communities that are basically meeting all of the criteria of, resilience, healthy, equitable, just, beautiful, and net positive. This idea that, I think it was a Harvard E.O. Wilson who talks about ants. He basically said there are more ants, 10 times the body weight of ants than there are humans on the planet. And they eat, a quarter of their weight in every day. So they're farming, ants are farmers, and they are like much bigger in terms of mass than humans put together. Yet they create ecologically net positive results. In other words, they create soil and fertility, and we eat, we destroy. So like we can find a way to get the sweet spot in harmony with life. And I think schools of design. I just think that biomimicry and schools of design, permaculture, those things need to be part of our literacy in our colleges and universities.
There's a question from one of the attendees saying, this is the first time I've heard a panel of Iranian Americans focused on climate action, justice, and equity. So promising and hopeful. I'm wondering if they could provide a specific call to action for those of us watching, the younger generation and beyond. So in the work that you're doing, each of you, are there certain things that you think people can plug into, support financially, advocate for a particular policy? I mean, we are in this, thankful that we have a little moment of reprieve from the last administration where there's a call to return to the climate accords, and you're attending this summit tomorrow, Atossa. So maybe you might want to even tell us a little bit about what you see as some of the national and international initiatives that people should keep on their radar, and if there's anything specific that any of you want to recommend.
Well, I'll just say sacredheadwaters.org. We're looking for bright minds, and from volunteers to interns to people who want to work with us or contribute to our work. We're developing a basically action plan for transitioning the economic system to a socially just and ecologically sound, solution pathways for the headwaters region in the Ecuadorian, Peruvian Amazon, led by indigenous peoples. So we are, have such really huge vision for where we're going. We could use all hands on deck. There's also work that's happening at Amazon Watch that's really targeting commodities and investments that affect us right here, that, our money in the United States and our markets are contributing to the destruction of the Amazon. There's a lot of policy work, like I mentioned, getting cities and municipalities to even adopt the rights of nature or protect watersheds or protect, or support fossil fuel non-proliferation. There's just infinite amount of things. But I would say my advice to young people are, hook up with 4 or 5 of your friends who you love spending time and brainstorming and talking to, together form something that makes sense for your interests and your region. And I think that, basically we change happens in communities. So change happens in communities and of people, communities of activism. So it's infinite amount of work that can happen. Right now, the Biden administration, we're holding the Biden, we launched a climate, Amazon climate forum last week. We're pushing the Biden administration to take action for the Amazon, but not to support dictators and Trumps of Brazil and the corporations, but to really do it in a way that it makes a difference, it's transformative. So we can and should push our own government on climate solutions. But, I think that for the biggest thing is to have agency, to feel like, yes, I as an individual have agency. I can influence the future and I must, I can be that immune system cell in the body that's, working to respond to the threat of the existential threat that the host is facing. And that, that comes from, working on surrounding yourself with people that inspire you and plugging in, or it doesn't really even matter where you're plugging in. There are many, many streams and rivulets that lead to the ocean. So find one of them.
Thank you. Farhad?
I mean, I would echo everything that Atosa just said, and I would say, for folks who are in a financial position to support work, I cannot emphasize enough more money to the grassroots organizing sector. Transformative change has always been led by successful social movements, and successful social movements are always led by those who are most impacted. I want to name that this includes the kind of work that both my co-panelists do. So an important appreciation there. This could be local organizations in your own community or in a community that you have some connection to. There are also plenty of regional or national or international intermediaries that can help, donors or folks from family philanthropy get resources to the right groups on the ground. And just want to name that this isn't just about supporting organizations with climate or environment in their name. I mean, look at the Movement for Black Lives is 150 amazing organizations. They're doing amazing work, multi-issue. And I deeply believe that a world in which Black people are free is a world in which all of us are free, right? And so there are formations like that are moving multiple issues forward, whether it be climate and environment or any number of other issues, and weaving together the intersections. And so I'm always happy to help folks identify those groups. But, for folks who aren't in a position to support financially, just to echo what Atosa said, just being a full person and engaging at every level. This is about how we engage with our families, our neighbors. It really is a fractal where every level of interaction, that successful social movements, it's not to say that we're obsessed and can't put an issue down, but it means that it's reflected in everything we do. So it's not just how you're engaging on policy questions or showing up for, a big issue or a big march or something like that. It's also how we engage with our neighbors. I think the challenge has been around climate is that, 15 or so years ago, there was such a push around a sort of capitalist consumer organizing that we're going to beat the climate crisis if we all buy different light bulbs and ride our bikes and go vegetarian, which is not to say that those things don't make a difference, but that is not a path to building a level of political power. We need to change these things. It's the right decisions for many of us to make individually, but it really puts the onus on a bunch of individuals rather than acknowledging that there's consolidated power. And I think we have a little bit of a hangover from that, where the climate problem seems way too big and there's nothing we can do individually. And I think that's just not true. I think we just need to transcend that hyper individualistic frame that was given to us in the past. And finally, I'll just say, connecting with each other as Iranian-Americans in more spaces like this. I mean, I've been really impressed by other immigrant and refugee communities who connect across sectors and do a little bit of ecosystem facilitation and relationship building based on what they have in common. I think we already do some of that already, but I think there's an opportunity for us to do a lot more.
Thank you. Mona, do you want to add anything about ways that people can plug in and transform in their individual or collectively to address this issue?
Sure. I think just find what you love. Find what you love doing and become really good at it, and have a skill that's unique to you, and then be an environmentalist in that way. Whether you become an environmental engineer or an environmental teacher or an environmental leader or whatever. I mean, to be an environmentalist, to have a skill that you can add to the movement is really important. So I think really, really, really just focus on what you bring to the table as a unique individual. We can't all be engineers, for example, that fight coastal erosion. We don't all have that same skill set. We can't all be farmers, but we can be something to add our piece to the environmental movement. So look at yourself and what do you gravitate to and what do you love, and honor that and build that skill. So I would just end it with how I began, which is find what you love, become really good at it, build a skill, and then contribute that to the movement.
Great, thank you. I just want to see if there's any more questions out there in the audience. If you do, please put them in the chat. We have a few more minutes. One thing I wanted to maybe ask you is to tell us a little bit about, in your work, who or what inspires you to keep going, because as you pointed out, big systemic change takes not only vision, but tenacity and resilience. So who and what inspires you to keep going, and where can we learn more about your inspirations? Atossa.
Well, I'm always inspired spending time in the forest with indigenous people who are, incredibly knowledgeable, skillful, kind, community oriented, and I learn from them. So I, really encourage you to connect with the indigenous people in your community. They are still here in North America. There are incredible movements, the Indigenous Environment Network, the Standing Rock movements, and the movements that are fighting the pipelines right now all across North America. Connect and support and be a support and amplifier for those movements, I think is always great. I mean, of course, I've learned a lot from systems thinkers like, Fritjof Capra, who wrote the book, The Web of Life, and people like them, as I mentioned, David Corton, who is basically changed the story, changed the future. There's many. I can give you a list. I could share with in a future email to the group some of my favorite reading lists. But certainly the work of grassroots activists has been so empowering. And so, I remember the work of Wangari Maathai when I was really young, in my 20s, and she was a Green Belt movement leader in Kenya, and she blew me away, by the power of one person to organize millions of women across Kenya to create a huge green belt. And I've also met people like that in Tajikistan who are doing similar, women organizing reforestation across the Pamir Mountains. So I know they exist. I'm sure they exist in Iran. We could also do what we can to hold up some of those heroes in Iran that are working to restore forests, restore ecological corridors, restore wildlife. And, of course, it's a lot more dangerous, that work there, than it is around the world. But anyways, so some of what I would say.
Thank you. Farhad?
I think similarly to what Atossa said, my biggest inspirations are always when I get to spend time with community members and community leaders and community organizations. And really, I think in lots of different ways, right? Spending time with folks just as full people, closing down a bar together or going for a hike together or something like that. But I think that the two things that have always had the most profound impact on me is seeing solutions that have been bottom up and have been hard won, built at the community level, whether those be alternate energy infrastructure or political shifts or local living economy work. And then for me, again, as a lefty straight out of central casting, direct action, participating in, being part of the support of folks from marginalized and oppressed communities who are seizing power, right? Even when our political economy doesn't give it to them. And that can be a really beautiful, joyous, celebratory thing to witness and to be given the opportunity to support.
Thank you. Mana?
So I'm inspired by the young people in my program. Case example, there's a young woman named Jade Sweeney. I doubt she's on this call. She is an African-American young woman. She was about 16 when I met her, and she decided to start a bee apiary in her inner city, low-income high school. So that was her, to grow on what I said earlier, that was what she brought to her special skill, was that she loved bees and wanted to create an apiary. So that is how she showed up in her high school. And then she recruited other students who all joined the apiary program. And in that way, be atypical. You know, the atypical environmentalists are what inspire me. You know, someone who is non-traditional, having a swarm of bees in a inner city high school is atypical. So I'm inspired by the people who really stand out and move to their own beat of their, what is the expression, beat of their own drum. So those kids inspire me the most. Hopefully I'll just keep working with young people and the inspiration will just continue. And hopefully everyone on this call can be who they needed when they were younger and show up for young people as who they needed when they were young.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, there's a question, and for some reason I'm not able to read it. So Farhad, can you read the question? And one more thing I want to say before we run out of time is that modeling for others is such an important part of, you know, doing this work. And right before you, we have 3 wonderful models of young Iranian Americans who are doing important work. And I think there was another person who was going to be with us. Her name is Yasamin Ansari, and she successfully ran a campaign for city council in Tucson, and she finally won in a runoff. And the huge platform she ran on was an environmental platform. So also stepping up in municipal elections and making climate change part of it, I think, is an important thing as well, but also just modeling. So I wanted to say that to all the Iranian Americans who are asking, what can we do? It's like, you be the first one, and that's a good place to start. Okay, Farhad, will you answer Tawfiq's question?
I mean, I don't know that I have an answer, but I have enthusiasm for the subject of hitting global warming profiteers where it hurts most, and just want to say that you know, fossil fuel divestment and also divestment of related industries and formations. I mean, there are clearly people who make money off of treating immigrants poorly. There are clearly people who make money off of, you know, putting kids in cages. And so I think there's a lot of people, I mean, the fact of a capitalist political economy is if something's bad is happening, somebody else is making money off of it, right? So the idea of financial campaigns that organize around hitting these profiteers where it hurts most really resonates for me. I'm a big fan of the divestment campaigns that try to go after the big banks and the big investors, but I think there's a lot of consumer organizing, as was mentioned in the question as well, that could be really interesting to consider.
I imagine that hitting the global warming profiteers is a part of what is the work that you're doing. And I just wondered if you had any specifics or specific names of campaigns or that you want to recommend to people.
Yeah, Amazon Watch has published these reports the last year called Complicity in Destruction. And we looked at basically supply chains, for example, beef from the rainforest, beef from the Amazon, and where it's being sold in North America. And we looked at, you know, also financial institutions. What are the big financial institutions? We looked at banks that are financing, for example, the oil trade, and also investment firms that invest in extractive industries. And we've gone after a lot of those companies. And, you know, that work is key. It requires letter writing by the public. It requires media attention. It requires, you know, basically pressure and protest and direct action. And you know, that work needs to happen. So, and now we're working, you know, now I feel like one of the key things we're working on globally is to target the financial institutions that use our taxpayer money and try to work on poverty alleviation and development across the world, like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. We're basically pushing the envelope on getting these banks and also the private banks that they cooperate with to cancel debt, developing world debt. Because of the pandemic, the majority of countries, not just poor countries, but even middle income countries now have, you know, basically their national debts are larger than their total GDP, their total gross domestic product. their debt are bigger than their total gross domestic product. And so, and who are the debt holders? The debt holders are governments, and there are countries like China and the US, and there are also banks like Chase Manhattan and JP Morgan Chase, and BlackRock and those kinds of banks, Credit Suisse. These financial, I would say the global financial elite are having a stranglehold on the governments of the world in places like Ecuador, for example, where the government has to mortgage the Amazon and sell the future oil that would come out the next 10 years out of the Amazon to basically be able to stay solvent as a government. That's an injustice. We need to work on a global debt cancellation movement, and that's building. And that's, I think, where I'm part of some movements that are helping seed that effort.
Right. Thank you so much. We're out of time, but I really want to offer you my warmest gratitude for your time and sharing your vision and your incredibly important work with us. And I hope that folks who've been listening will follow up and learn more about the organizations, foundations, and initiatives that Mona, Farhad, and Atusa are involved with. And I really appreciate also that you spoke also to our community, because I think it's so important that Iranian Americans take very seriously their ability to weigh in and participate in this. So thank you for your wonderful model and for being with us. And I hope that things will be transformative in the next 5 to 10 years so that we can creep back from the precipice.
Persis, thank you to you as well, and to Mona and Farhad. It's been a real joy.
Yes, and happy Earth Day, everyone. And I didn't mention that we've just are coming out of a pandemic, but that's another sort of symptom of this idea of both our interconnectedness and also our imperiledness. So if we didn't learn one thing from that, I guess we should see it as a wake-up call for this urgency about our interconnection to one another. So thank you so much for coming on Zoom, and I look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Audience as well. Good night.
Good night.